beneath the placid surface of Abu Qir Bay, off the coast of Egypt, lies a silence that conceals a cataclysm. For over a millennium, it was a ghost story, a legend whispered by historians. The great city of Thonis-Heracleion, the gateway to the Pharaohs, gone without a trace. It was not just a city, but the nexus of two worlds, where Greek merchants met Egyptian priests. Then, in an instant of geological time, it vanished from the map, its temples and treasures surrendered to the sea. How does a metropolis, the customs hub for an entire empire, simply disappear? Was it a slow decline or a sudden, violent end? The historical record is fragmented, the eyewitness accounts lost to the ages. But the seafloor holds the evidence, a submerged crime scene waiting for forensic examination. Now, let us open the case file and begin the investigation. To understand the scale of the cataclysm, we must first reconstruct the world we have lost. Long before Alexandria rose to prominence, Thonis-Heracleion was the linchpin of the Egyptian Empire, its indispensable gateway to the Mediterranean world. The city carried a dual identity, a name for each of its dominant cultures: Thonis to the native Egyptians, Heracleion to the Greek merchants who flocked to its harbor. Situated amid the shifting, waterlogged landscape of the Nile Delta's westernmost arm, the Canopic branch, it was a city uniquely engineered for its purpose. To control, tax, and process every foreign vessel seeking entry into the kingdom of the Pharaohs. For centuries, during Egypt's late period, all maritime trade was funneled through this single port by pharaonic decree. It was the designated emporion, the mandatory port of trade. When we examine the archaeological record recovered from the seabed, we find this history written in amphorae and anchors. Thousands of ceramic jars, once filled with wine, olive oil, and other goods from across the Aegean, lie alongside the remnants of Egyptian craftsmanship. This was a cosmopolitan powerhouse, a clearinghouse of commerce and culture on a grand scale. We can envision its canals choked with vessels, the air thick with the sound of a dozen languages as merchants haggled over shipments of grain, papyrus, and exotic perfumes destined for Greece, and silver and timber destined for the Egyptian interior. The city's customs officials, operating under the authority of the Grand Temple, would have meticulously recorded and taxed every transaction, enriching the state and the city's priestly class immeasurably. At the city's heart stood its spiritual and administrative core, the colossal temple of Amun-Gareb. This was not merely a place of worship, but the central bank, the land registry, and the seat of divine authority. It was here that the syncretism of the two cultures was most potent. The Egyptians revered Amun-Gareb, while the Greeks identified him with their own divine hero, Heracles, who they believed had first visited Egypt at this very spot. This association gave the city its Greek name and consecrated it as a place of immense mythological importance. Recovered from the bay, a magnificent black granodiorite stela, the Decree of Nectanebo, details the temple's immense wealth, stipulating that a 10% tax on all goods imported through the city was to be allocated directly to its treasury. It was also here that new pharaohs came to receive their divine legitimacy from the god, solidifying Thonis-Heracleion's critical role in the sacred rituals of kingship. The very geography that made the city a perfect port also concealed its fatal flaw. Thonis-Heracleion was not built on solid ground, but on a series of sand and silt islands, crisscrossed by a network of canals. It was a metropolis floating on unstable deltaic sediment, saturated with water. This precarious foundation, while masterfully managed for centuries, made the city exceptionally vulnerable to geological pressures. The weight of its monumental stone architecture, the grand temple, towering statues, and countless buildings, was immense, pressing down year after year on the soft, waterlogged clay beneath. For generations, this delicate balance of land and water held. But deep beneath the foundations of its temples and canals, a geological clock was ticking, counting down to a moment of catastrophic failure. For 1,200 years, Thonis-Heracleion was little more than a phantom, referenced in ancient texts but lost to geography. The investigation into its disappearance only truly began in the year 2000, when French underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio and his team from the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, IEASM, began a systematic survey of Abu Qir Bay. Using advanced geophysical equipment, side-scan sonar to map the seabed's topography, and nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometers to detect buried structures, they were able to pierce through the thick blanket of sediment. What emerged from the data was the ghost of a city, the unmistakable outlines of harbors, canals, and the foundations of massive buildings. The case file was no longer about a myth, but a tangible, submerged reality. This discovery allowed us to move from historical speculation to forensic analysis, examining the city as a vast archaeological crime scene. The primary suspect in the city's demise is the very ground upon which it was built. The Nile Delta is a geologically young and dynamic environment formed by millennia of sediment deposited by the river. When we analyze the sub-seabed geology, we find that Thonis-Heracleion rested on an immense lens of soft, unstable clay, up to 20 meters thick. This material is inherently unstable, prone to a geological process known as subsidence, the gradual, steady sinking of the ground under its own weight. The immense load of the city's stone temples, statues, and port infrastructure would have dramatically accelerated this process. For centuries, the city was slowly sinking, fighting a losing battle against gravity and rising sea levels. This chronic condition, however, does not explain the speed and totality of its disappearance. A slow sinking would have allowed for abandonment, for the relocation of its treasures. The evidence on the seafloor points not to a gentle decline, but to a sudden, violent end. The investigation required a trigger, a specific event that could turn the city's chronic vulnerability into acute catastrophe. The geological culprit is a powerful earthquake. The region, while not as active as the San Andreas Fault, is subject to seismic activity from the intersection of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. A significant tremor with an epicenter near the Nile Delta would have sent powerful shock waves radiating through the unstable, waterlogged sediments. When we examine the placement of the ruins, we find compelling evidence of just such an event. The remains are not scattered randomly, but show patterns consistent with a sudden, directional force. Heavy columns lie toppled in uniform rows, and building foundations are fractured and displaced. This is not the work of centuries of decay. It is the signature of a violent, instantaneous shock The earthquake provided the energy, the fatal jolt that pushed the city past its breaking point. This seismic shock initiated the kill mechanism, soil liquefaction. This is a phenomenon where saturated, unconsolidated sediment, like the clay beneath Thonis-Heracleion, temporarily loses its strength and behaves like a liquid when subjected to intense shaking. The vibrations from the earthquake would have increased the water pressure between the soil particles, effectively suspending them. The solid ground that had supported a metropolis for centuries would have transformed in a matter of minutes into a dense, turbulent fluid. We can picture the terrifying result. The city's massive stone structures, including the Great Temple, suddenly lost their foundations. Instead of resting on solid earth, they were now floating on a sea of liquid clay. Their immense weight would have driven them downwards, sinking into the newly liquefied ground as if it were quicksand. The final, conclusive evidence comes from the archaeological divers themselves, from the heart of the city's sacred precinct. The excavation of the Temple of Amun-Gareb provides the smoking gun. Divers found the temple's colossal stone blocks and columns not resting on the seafloor, but deeply embedded within a now solidified layer of clay, sand, and debris. They had punched through the ground, pulled down by their own mass. Crucially, artifacts from the temple's treasury and the remains of animals intended for sacrifice were found trapped in this same layer of destruction, indicating they were caught in the final, catastrophic moment of collapse. This paints a chilling and unambiguous picture. An earthquake triggered widespread soil liquefaction, and the city of Thonis-Heracleion did not simply sink into the sea. It was violently swallowed by the earth upon which it was built. The investigation reveals a perfect storm of unfortunate geology and seismic fury, a verdict written in stone and mud. The evidence presented in this case file allows for a definitive verdict. The disappearance of Thonis-Heracleion was not the work of a single cause, but a fatal convergence of three factors. First, the city was built upon inherently unstable foundations, a pre-existing condition of soft, water-saturated clay that made it fundamentally vulnerable. Second, a powerful earthquake served as the trigger, delivering a catastrophic shock to this fragile geological setting. Finally, this shock induced widespread soil liquefaction, the mechanism that transformed the city's foundations into a fluid medium, causing the metropolis to be swallowed by the earth itself. The mystery that endured for over a millennium is solved not by myth, but by the cold, hard science of geology and archaeology. Yet, the legacy of this cataclysm is profoundly ironic. The very disaster that erased Thonis-Heracleion from the map is also what preserved it so exquisitely. By rapidly burying the city in a thick layer of airless silt, the liquefaction event created an extraordinary time capsule. This anaerobic environment protected organic materials and metal artifacts from the corrosion and decay that would have destroyed them in open water or on land. What we are exploring today is not a scattered field of eroded ruins, but a snapshot of life frozen at the very moment of its obliteration. The investigation into the city's death has, in turn, led to its resurrection. From the depths, the human story of Thonis-Heracleion reemerges with astonishing clarity. The colossal, 5-meter-tall statues of a pharaoh and the goddess Isis were not just religious icons. They were expressions of power and piety that dominated the city's skyline. Delicate gold jewelry and imported Greek ceramics speak of a wealthy, cosmopolitan populace. The discovery of over 700 ancient anchors and more than 60 shipwrecks, perfectly preserved in the mud, testifies to its unrivaled status as a maritime hub. Each artifact, from the grandest temple stele to the humblest bronze ritual tool, is a voice from the past, allowing us to reconstruct the lives of the people who walked these streets, unaware of the ground dissolving beneath their feet.